Good afternoon, everyone. Our chair is not able to be with us today, so I'll open the meeting and begin by asking for nominations for a temporary chair. Steve Howard?
Brad Rivers.
You nominate Brad Rivers?
I'd like to decline. Just in case I may have to leave, well, I do have to leave around 3:15. So
Okay.
just in case we go long, I'd hate to be in the chair and have to vacate.
Very well. Any other nominations? Ola Hammerland?
I would like to nominate the member sitting right next to Brad, Natalie Jameson.
I would prefer not to. I'm not a standing member on this committee, to be honest. So
Okay.
yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
I'd like to nominate Gordon McNeely.
All right. Mr. McNeely, would you accept the
Yes,
nomination?
I
Okay. All those in favor of Mr. McNeely taking the chair, please say aye.
Aye.
Carried. Please take the chair. So right there. Motion to adopt the agenda.
Okay. We'll just have a motion to adopt the adopt the agenda. Anybody? Steve Howard.
Okay.
So excited to be here today. Today is standing committee of the Special Committee on Climate Change. It's Thursday, January 23rd, 1:30 p.m. So in the chamber we have on, as guests, we have our MLAs here, Stephen Howard, Brad Rivers, Natalie Jameson, Sonny Gallant, and Ola Hammerland. And my name is Gordon McNeely, and I'm just chairing the meeting for today. So we're excited to have a briefing on the citizens' assemblies and community engagement. And Laura Berry, again, this is through Skype, so I just wanted to read a special note for the viewers at home. To view the slideshow online, today's presentation will be delivered via Skype. The presenter is Miss Laura Berry. She has prepared a slideshow to accompany her remarks. Those watching the live stream of proceedings can access the slideshow by visiting www.assembly.pe.ca. Then click on Committees, Current Committees, and Special Committee on Climate Change. At that page, you will see a link to Ms. Berry's slideshow. So once we'll let her finish her entire presentation, and then after that we will ask questions, and we will, because it's Skype, we'll just make sure we're just speaking a little bit louder. Hi, Ms. Berry, can you hear us in here?
I can. Can you hear me?
Oh yeah, it's very well. So what I'll do now is I'll turn it over to you, and feel comfortable to take as long as you want, and we're really excited to have you here today.
Great, thank you so much. I'll try to keep it to 15 minutes, but it's good to have the flexibility. So thank you to the entire committee for inviting me to speak with you all today and to share some thoughts and some knowledge about the importance of public participation as Prince Edward Island is reckoning with the climate emergency and the situation that we're currently facing. I actually had the privilege of visiting Prince Edward Island last year to speak at the university at the Sustainable Futures Conference, and it was incredibly clear to me it's an incredibly special place with a very strong sense of community. So I was really honored and very pleased to learn that the committee has recognized sort of the need for public engagement as part of this process that you all are going through to determine how to reach the climate targets you all have set. So as has been mentioned, you all have in front of you a printed document with a slideshow presentation with page numbers. So you're welcome to follow along. I'll also reference slide titles. I'll get started if you guys want to go to slide number 2 after the first title page. I think it'd be helpful to begin actually with a short overview of why public participation is generally seen as an important part of addressing environmental issues. I think it's something that some people take for granted or think that is sort of just part of how we make decisions. But how, especially in the case of climate change, And with setting goals for decarbonization and developing plans to reach those goals, it's going to be increasingly important that we pay attention to it. So on slide 2 is actually the remit of the Special Committee on Climate Change that I pulled from the website. And you can see there's this clear recognition that there are multiple pathways forward to address climate impacts on PEI and also to reach this goal of 30% decrease of greenhouse gas emissions from 2005 levels. And then thus public input needs to be sought in order to sort of determine which of those pathways is the best way forward. So while it's often seen as sort of an intrinsic good within a democracy and within our sort of democratic system, public participation is actually a very sort of tangible good in terms of decision making. So improving the quality and longevity of policy decisions, implementation is usually has been shown to be more effective because public participation increases public legitimacy of decision-making processes in the eyes of the public and can often reduce conflict over, very difficult issues. In this case, environmental issues. How do we switch to electric vehicles? How do we make these decisions that have serious impacts on people's lives? And a lot of, multiple studies have demonstrated that whether or not the public actually accepts a decision, it hinges on whether they perceive it as having gone through a fair decision-making process. So when we're dealing with issues like sea level rise, erosion, extreme weather, and increased temperatures, public participation is going to be incredibly important to help chart this clear path forward to address how we deal with those issues that are very tangible, impacting people's lives and livelihoods, and the policy response that we have to have in response. And one other sort of thing that's useful to mention is that there's actually currently a pretty high level of public distrust of environmental decision making, at least where I'm from in the United States, but worldwide generally, partially because environmental decision making is usually done by experts. So scientific experts who are, of course, vital to environmental policy making, but the focus on science-based decision making has led to a tendency to undervalue issues like equity and accountability in policy making. And so having these sorts of top-down decisions without widespread public input can lead to and have led to policies that disregard local priorities or specific community contexts and can lead to increased conflict. And the example of the yellow vest protests in France after an increase in gas tax, which was specifically an environmental policy, can sort of be seen as a result of that. So at the international level, and I'm sure you all are familiar with this, public participation is seen as incredibly important to sustainable development. It's goal 16 of the Sustainable Development Goals at the UN to basically call for responsible, inclusive, participatory, and representative decision-making at all levels of government. And so most governments, most developed countries, if not all of them, have some sort of formal institution or process for generating public input on decisions that impact the environment. So public comment periods, open hearings, even more direct forms of decision-making like referenda. And Canada is no exception. The one that comes to mind, the Federal Impact Assessment Act, provides a forum through which the public can engage on environmental decisions through environmental impact assessments. And then also many agencies and provincial governments have essentially stated that this is a high priority in terms of decision making. So moving on to the next slide, I find it's useful to put some boundaries around what kinds of public participation exist. And rather than speaking about specific mechanisms, though I'll speak about specifically citizens' assemblies in a moment, it's useful to understand sort of the key characteristics that we're looking at when we approach public participation on climate change and how it can be used to help set targets and goals and plans that are actually going to be implementable and effective. So these three major factors that I've sort of identified are, who are the participants in a process? Who's able to participate? What are the boundaries on whose voices are heard? Who's actually actively excluded or passively excluded unintentionally? And then what's their actual role? What are citizens, what are participants who are asked to participate in this process? What are they there to do? And then communication is another sort of key factor. How do they interact with each other? How do individuals who are asked to participate outside of holding formal office, how do they interact with each other? Do they talk to each other at all? Or are they standing up at a public meeting to say their piece and then sit back down and never have a chance to speak? So, or are they, for example, simply spectators to a decision-making process where they're witness but don't have the opportunity to speak? Or do they deliberate with each other? Do they actually have a formal sort of space to have conversations, give each other different information, hear from experts and decision makers themselves about what they think is the right way to go forward, and then have an opportunity to share their opinions? And then finally, authority, which I think is actually somewhat of an spoken about topic when it comes to public participation, because you can gather public participation and public input as much as you'd like, but really what matters is how that's actually expressly linked to decision making. So do participants come into a process expecting to influence decision makers, or do they simply participate so that they themselves can be more informed when they go to vote, or to participate in some other forum, or just live their lives? And then how do decisions that participants come to, or their statements, how do they actually become policy, and do they ever? So I find that this is a sort of a useful way to evaluate how we think about public participation, rather than just saying, okay, well, we need to invite the public to participate, let's hold a town meeting or hold an open comment period. So moving on to the next slide, slide 4. So this is actually, in recent years, in the past couple of decades, there's been a broad shift within both academic and sort of applied conceptions of public participation towards this more deliberative notion of how citizens engage in decision-making within democracy itself. Because when we think of the avenues through which individual people, ordinary people, are asked or invited to formally engage in policymaking processes, leaving aside activism for now, because that can be seen as another way to express sort of civic engagement. What we're really talking about is kind of the role of an individual citizen that they're given, and what opportunities they have to participate. So, on the very left, not very left, but the left-hand column, thinking about representative democracy, sort of typical voting in elections for representatives, individuals are asked to express their preferences or express their opinions through a very specific mechanism, which is voting, and occasionally, as a member of an interest group or otherwise. And so when we talk about public opinion on climate change, it's really kind of an aggregation of individual preferences that we put together through voting, through an electoral contest. And then, what I was explaining a little bit before, and where we're kind of at now, is this more participatory democracy concept, where we have a representative democracy, a system, a legislative body that makes decisions, but then there are specific opportunities for citizens to take part in this decision making through official formal spaces. So things like public comment periods and et cetera. So citizens are sort of invited to be an ongoing participant to, certain extent. Sometimes it's limited depending on the context. Sometimes some issues don't have open participation. And sometimes there are legal requirements for citizens to be invited to participate. But what we're going to talk about now, I think, is deliberative democracy, which is this sort of new, fun, concept around decision making, especially with regards to complex political issues, where citizens are actually invited to be much more active participants and active in public deliberation, which is a specific, sort of phrase used to reference not just participation as sort of being consulted as an individual, but taking part in a process where through a group of people, usually participants are asked to be considered deliberators, where they're given information, they're given time and resources to actually work through a complex political problem and express their understanding and ideas about what should happen to a decision-making body, and hopefully to have those decisions be taken into account in a more significant way. So moving on to slide 5, the recent increase in the use of citizens' assemblies, which is one tool or one form of sort of deliberative democratic or public engagement, is reflecting this shift. So, there's increasing political polarization, legislative gridlock, and also still somehow a more politically engaged public has led to some governments, especially in the case of climate change and issues of gridlock on climate change specifically, to use citizens' assemblies as a tool to break through those issues, and also to sort of do what I was mentioning before around gaining political support and building trust in the decisions that the government is making on climate change. So a citizens' assembly is, in essence, a process through which a decision-making body, so a legislature or, even an individual third-party group, an organization, a business, but we'll focus on legislatures, essentially establishes and selects a representative group of people, so people from all walks of life, to learn about a specific complex issue through a kind of a series, a process. Experts' presentations and materials are presented to them. They work together to discuss and deliberate potential solutions to this problem that they've been presented with. And then they provide actually collective recommendations back to that decision-making body about the issue that they've taken on. So this process can vary in terms of what it looks like, and I'll talk a little bit more about specific examples, but it's usually facilitated both by, like I said, a formal sort of government body, and then also a third-party agency that helps with facilitation and helps to make sure that things are neutral and information that's provided is accurate. And so the assembly is usually presented with specific questions that they themselves aim to answer, usually in the form of a report with recommendations that is published at the end of this process. So rather than simply asking for individual opinions on an issue, a citizens' assembly and other deliberative participation mechanisms provide the opportunity for a group, representative of the wider population that we're trying to get a sense of what they think and care about. It gives them the opportunity to actually reach, or at least approach, consensus on an issue through this facilitated space. And as I've spoken to people and talked about the merits of citizens' assemblies before, a lot of people think that it seems a little bit too good to be true because of our increasingly polarized political environment. But a number of case studies and just general academic literature on deliberative engagement have demonstrated that it actually really is possible and fairly common for a group of people with widely different backgrounds and understandings of an issue to come to agreement on the best pathway forward if they're given enough time and the resources to do so. So citizens' assemblies have a couple of key sort of principles that differentiate them from other processes, citizen engagement processes. So number one, they're selected to be representative. The people who take part are chosen, so they reflect the wider population that's being considered. So usually in terms of demographics, so age, gender, ethnicity, social class, and sometimes relevant attitudes about the specific political issue in question. And second, it takes time. This is a process that requires engagement and investment. And so, because they go through a process of learning. So, reading materials, presentations by experts, so that everyone essentially are on the same level when they are deliberating, and then also deliberation itself. So, through small groups, through large facilitated discussions. And then finally, decision-making, which oftentimes happens after a long period of deliberation and then is conducted through voting. So these are broad generalizations, but this is usually the process by which this happens. And then again, the understanding that this process is a significant investment, that hopefully the outcome of this would be adopted by a legislative body or put to a referendum or otherwise integrated into policy. That is essentially the assumption that this is a fundamental investigation into this issue. And so the recommendations of this should be taken seriously above and beyond sort of typical other forms of public participation. So I realize I'm at 15 minutes already, but I will,
Keep going.
So moving on to slide 6. So when it comes to citizens' assemblies, Prince Edward Island would be the first government in Canada and actually in North America entirely to undertake a citizens' assembly on climate change, if this is the way forward on this path. And so, but this concept isn't entirely new to the country. Both the provincial government of British Columbia and Ontario in the early 2000s held citizens' assemblies on the issue of electoral reform, specifically, another complex political issue that, having public participation is important in. So in British Columbia, the recommendation basically of the assembly was to change, I think, from first past the post single transferable vote system, and on Ontario, which was modeled after British Columbia, the final recommendation was to switch to a mixed member proportional representation system. Both of the recommendations were led to official referendums being held, but neither of the votes actually made it past the 60% threshold required to change the system. But the issue itself, was seen as really critically important to have citizen participation. So even though the referendum itself failed, it was a process through which the citizens of those provinces were able to engage in a more deep, sort of deliberate democratic way on an issue key to their democracy. So, so moving to slide 7. I'm going to talk a little bit about some examples of previous citizens' assemblies on climate change, all of which have happened in the past, 3 years, some of which you might have heard of. So the first Citizens' Assembly on climate change was actually held in Ireland in 2017 as one of, I think 7 or 8, but multiple complex issues, political issues that were posed to the Citizens' Assembly that was formed for recommendations. So you might have heard about the referendum on amending the Irish Constitution to loosen the country's restrictions on abortion. That referendum was held and passed after the majority of the Citizens' Assembly, which was representative of the fairly politically conservative Irish public at large, recommended that those restrictions be lifted. And so this was a really significant sort of public moment for citizens' assemblies by which it demonstrated it's possible for a very polarized country to come together and make a decision about something, very complex political issue. But when it comes to climate change, the Citizens' Assembly met over 2 weekends and had expert presentations, as I mentioned before, and deliberated on the question, the key sort of question of how the state can make Ireland a leader in tackling climate change. And so after this process, the Assembly ended up generating 13 key recommendations on some very specific policy, nuanced issues, from everything from complete removal of subsidies for cutting and burning peat to ensuring, 97% of the Assembly recommended that climate change be the center of policy making in Ireland. And even 80%, which is, thinking about these numbers, higher than most in terms of electoral results. These are much higher than typical electoral results. 80% of the members said they'd be willing to pay higher taxes on carbon-intensive activities if the policies themselves were also equitable. So these were pretty significant recommendations that were sent to the Irish Parliament, who have been considering them for a long time. Unfortunately, have not actually put them up for a vote in any meaningful way at the moment. However, it was, a pretty significant demonstration of public opinion on climate change across the country, and is widely seen as sort of the model for citizens' assemblies going forward. So moving on to slide 8. A more recent example, in January of 2019, just last year, in Oxford, UK, the Oxford City Council members declared a climate emergency. They passed a declaration of climate emergency, a resolution that also agreed to create a citizens' assembly in Oxford to help them, as a city, consider new carbon targets and additional measures to reduce carbon emissions. So the Oxford Citizens' Assembly involved a randomly selected representative sample of 50 Oxford residents, although I think it would actually ended up only being 44. Who learned about climate change and explored different options to cut carbon emissions that were presented to them through presentations from experts and also facilitated workshops. One of the nice things about, or the important things in my opinion about this process, was that the Oxford Climate Assembly, Citizens Assembly, was not asked whether climate change existed or not, because it was treated as a reality. And so moving beyond those questions of sort of whether climate change exists or not, I think is particularly important. And they were clear on taking a stand on that. And so participants in the assembly considered measures to reduce Oxford's carbon emissions to net zero, and also to reduce the city council's own municipal emissions to net zero by 2030, and also to consider whether or not the city itself should have a stated carbon neutrality target that was faster than the UK's national goal. And so essentially what ended up happening was that the Citizens Assembly decided that yes, actually, that the city itself should become carbon neutral faster than the 2050 timeline that had been set by the national government. And they actually decided to set it to net zero by 2020, so by the end of this year. And then actually just recently this month, there was an announcement from the council that showed that, or that announced that they were dedicating a £19 million climate emergency budget towards issues, projects around renewable energy, building retrofits, because most of their emissions came from buildings in Oxford. And so, things like a zero carbon system in council-owned buildings, new homes, and also working through the private rented sector. And then also transportation, which was the second biggest source of emissions, proposed changes for electric vehicle infrastructure, electric buses, taxis, and cycling. So all of these, sort of changes, these massive changes, and a £19 million budget came from the recommendations of the Citizens Assembly. So you can see that there was sort of this very clear tie between, declaring a climate emergency, resolving to engage the public, and then passing stronger and widely accepted sort of climate legislation. And then the final example on the next slide is another national example, which is actually happening this weekend, beginning. The UK Citizens Assembly on Climate Change, which was established after political pressure from Extinction Rebellion, which is an activist group very, powerful or significant in the United Kingdom, pushed the national government to establish a climate citizens assembly. So essentially, it's the same concept, bringing together a representative body. This time it's 110 people to deliberate over a set period of time on what the UK can actually do to get to net zero by 2050. And so they'll have experts and an advisory panel. They'll have very specific facilitated questions and resources and time for just normal average citizens to talk about the biggest issue that is facing them politically, and fundamentally in their lives. This is something that is becoming increasingly common, especially across Europe. I haven't mentioned the French Citizens Assembly, but that's also another example. But moving on to some final takeaways. So the first takeaway really is about how deliberative public engagement is valuable because it can help to tackle the how of complex public policy issues. Moving beyond just the kind of scientific, technological, we know we need to reduce X amount of emissions from the transportation sector to have a 50% chance of doing this. No, people themselves, have the opportunity and have been demonstrated to have the capacity to make these really difficult sorts of decisions about trade-offs, recognizing that, okay, now that I understand that climate change is going to cause my home to maybe be in danger, I'm more willing to say that we should electrify our bus system in town. These sorts of decisions, people don't often have the space or the capacity or the time to deliberate about what climate change and what climate policy is going to mean for their everyday lives. So providing these spaces, providing a deliberative context can help us actually get to understanding the how, essentially, of these complex issues in a more democratic manner than simply saying, this is what we're going to do and this is how we're going to do it. And if you don't like it, then too bad. And then takeaway number 2, ultimately the success of a deliberative process and going through this, fairly extensive and fairly resource intensive process depends on integrating the outcomes, the recommendations that you've asked from your citizens into policy and into action. So as we've seen, in Ireland, that has not happened as much at the federal level, but in Oxford, it has clearly led to really significant change insofar as their climate policy. So it's my opinion that, while citizens' assemblies don't typically have legislative sort of powers or aren't designated to have legislative powers, it is important to demonstrate sort of a clear pathway for where those recommendations go and how they'll actually be integrated into policy. And then finally, I have listed here on page 12 some resources for you all to look at on the case studies that I've referenced, and also a few general resources. But thank you very much for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions that I have.
Laura, that was a great presentation, and I think everybody was pretty engaged here. I don't know if you could see everybody, but we're very excited to have you speak, and we'll open the floor up to some questions now. So, Stephen Howard is going to ask the first question.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Ms. Berry. How much time would be appropriate for a citizens' assembly or whatnot to deliberate and come up with relevant and valid input?
So typically, and some of the examples that I've given, they are hosted over weekends. So obviously, it takes time and investment for someone to take time off from their job, similar to jury duty. But typically 2 weekends to 4 weekends is what I've seen so far. So, in total, depending on the size of the assembly and also the scope of the question, I would say probably no fewer than 2 weekends. I think if you were to host a citizens' assembly in Prince Edward Island and have the sort of the scope of the questions fairly well laid out. I know you all have a climate action plan that has specific areas and targets, so that would be helpful. So if I were to, off the cuff, design a citizens' assembly process, I would say that, having at least 1 weekend dedicated to learning and engagement, so expert presentations, and then 1 to 2 weekends of deliberation, perhaps less if necessary, but it really depends, and then 1 weekend or 1 day, 2 days to develop recommendations would be ideal. I think that what has been shown is that the longer people have to deliberate and have, learn about these issues, the more likely they are to reach consensus. And so it is, I think important to have that minimum of at least 2 to 3 weekends of time.
Thank you, Laura. Stephen Howard.
Thank you, Chair. So you kind of touched on it there, but taking 2 to 4 weekends out of citizens' assemblies' time, if we had 50 people or 100 people, that's quite taxing on this broad group we're talking about. What kind of resources would be appropriate to empower the process and make sure that people were interested in attending?
Absolutely. And so I can give you a little bit of context about the recent UK assembly. So 30,000 invitations went out to people and about 2,000 responded as being interested. And then about 150 were selected as by a computer as demographically representative. So the process itself, even selecting residents is itself taxing, although for a smaller population it wouldn't be as much. So similar, and I use, at least in the United States, use the equivalent of jury duty as sort of a way to describe it to people. But there are important considerations such as, allowing people to take time off of work, providing them with a stipend if they work on the weekends, or to help with transportation fees, food, very sort of typical space considerations. So accessibility is important for people, individuals who have children, childcare, providing the time and the resources for people to be able to effectively participate and make sure that you have a sort of representative sample of all folks does require facilitation and resources itself. However, that's part of the process, and part of the quote unquote the magic of deliberative democracy is that by evening the playing field for people, that does mean that they are then able to really engage fully in these questions in ways that they're not able to before. So yeah, I mean, it's similar to putting on a conference or another event, making sure that people's needs are met so that they can be fully present, essentially.
Yeah. Stephen Howard.
Thank you, Chair. One last one before I pass it along here. You mentioned that Oxford came out with some specific deliberations and recommendations related to climate change, and have they been actioned upon? And if so, it sounds like they were, but are there other examples of that?
Laura?
So yes, Oxford's the clearest example in terms of a citizens' assembly specifically leading to specific policy change, at least in terms of climate. So the Irish Citizens' Assembly on a number of different issues, they didn't just talk about climate change and women's rights, but they talked about an aging population, a couple of other key political issues that then were brought to the legislature, to the parliament itself, and then voted upon. And so I'm trying to think. So the French Citizens' Assembly, President Macron has said that whatever the recommendations of those citizens come up with essentially will be either put directly unfiltered to the legislature or passed through executive action. But again, since this is a fairly new process in terms of being implemented, there's still some sort of in progress. There are some smaller city and sort of small towns in the UK who have also gone through a citizens' assembly process, but I'm not familiar with ones that are specific that have, sort of radically changed their climate goals as a result. But Oxford's the clearest example and the most recent.
So we'll move on to the Minister of the Environment, Brad Chivers.
Thanks, Chair. With your indulgence, I'd like to welcome some people in the gallery.
Absolutely.
Yeah, welcome everyone, of course, but in particular, Phil Ferraro is here with his, I believe it's the group Engaging Youth in the Era of Climate Change, so it's really great to have you here and being engaged, right? That's part of what I think a Citizens' Assembly is all about as well, the way I understand it, so thank you for coming today. So, Chair, my question, I guess my first one is, and it's along the lines of what MLA Howard was talking about. On slide 5, you talk about participants are selected by sortition. And so I'm trying to wrap my idea around that. And right now we have advisory councils, for example. Like there's an Environment Advisory Council, and people apply through an engaged PEI process, and they're paid a per diem, and they go and they engage, and they want to be there. They apply to be there. First question, since this is by sortition, are you going to get people who maybe don't necessarily want to be there, like you said, with the jury duty type idea?
Laura?
Yes, and that's actually part of the point, is that, participation in policy change oftentimes is the folks who want to be there the most, the voices who can shout the loudest, essentially. And so even through, application processes, and as somebody who's very politically engaged myself, I understand and value participating in those processes. But I'll give the example of the UK. So they actually selected their representative sample by public opinion on climate change. So they have, a certain number of the citizens themselves are very concerned about climate change, some of whom are somewhat concerned. A fewer number are not really that concerned at all. And some of, I think maybe 3 out of the 110 don't think that climate change is an issue. And so, one of the purposes of this is to try to truly get a representative sample of a population and not simply reinforce the sort of polarized positions that are often elevated in public discourse around these kinds of issues. So it is difficult, and I think it feels kind of strange to, for example, actively invite people who don't necessarily think that climate change is a problem into a climate change conversation about the kinds of policies we should be passing. However, it is important, and I think that in terms of changing public opinion and demonstrating, as was in the case of the Ireland Citizens Assembly, that even with disparate opinions on the importance of issues, people can still come together and reach consensus, or at least close to. I think that that's a very powerful thing as a sort of expansion of our democratic process itself.
Brad Trivers?
No, thank you. And my next question was really, you'd mentioned how, citizens' assemblies are really good for complex issues. And of course, with complex issues like climate change, there's a lot of information to understand. And there's a lot of science that you need to understand as well. And of course, for example, within the Department of Environment, Water and Climate Change, we rely on experts, scientists, and we go to them and ask for their recommendations. And even as minister, I wouldn't pretend to understand all the science behind the recommendations that they're given to me. So I was just wondering, first off, how do you overcome that challenge when you've got this randomly selected group of citizens to make sure that they get the expertise they need to make sure they're making an informed decision, as opposed to maybe getting misinformation? And maybe you could comment along the lines of who sets the agenda as to what experts are brought in to inform them.
Laura Barrett?
That's a great question. I mean, I think that it is difficult because the past, sort of, I would say 4 decades probably of climate policy and sort of climate politics has been defined about, around the science itself. And, mostly about whether the impacts that we know are happening and if they're attributable to humans. And so to a certain extent, I think, it is the role of the facilitation body, which I think I mentioned before, is usually, the decision-making body, the assembly itself, as well as usually a third-party facilitator. So someone who is either, or not an individual, but usually I'm trying to think. So in Oxford, it was a market research group called Ipsos. There are other sort of facilitation consulting firms and other groups that have worked with conflict resolution and public participation in previous areas. So, in terms of who is setting the agenda and who's providing the information, it is, to a certain extent, of course, always going to be biased towards what it is that, whatever the question is. However, I think that people will surprise you in terms of understanding the science when they're given enough information and enough time to actually work through it. And also access to experts is something that the average person doesn't necessarily have. This is completely anecdotal, but I have had conversations with taxi drivers about climate science in which I was able to explain it in about 10 minutes. And people understood the ramifications of what that sort of means for the choices we have to make. So, I mean, that's a very sort of, I'm not trying to get around the fact that we have incredibly complex impacts and the issues of feedback loops and uncertainty and risk management and all of these issues that we need to consider. However, I do find that people often surprise me when we're willing to engage with them on the same level, bringing climate science, maybe the impacts of rising sea levels, to this is going to impact your business because people aren't going to be able to get to where you are because the road's going to be flooded. Bringing that to people's sort of, everyday lives is a way for them to engage with science in ways that sort of get away from the sort of technocratic, very difficult, complex side of things. And so that would be my general recommendation. I think the difficulty ultimately with climate change is that we're never going to know, even, despite all of the science and despite the decades of research, we never know exactly what's going to happen. We have some very, very, very good guesses and good predictions. And that's what we have to reckon with. And that's why we should engage people as much as possible.
Brad Trivers?
Well, thank you, Chair, and thanks for that response. It is tricky. I'm just wondering. So, and I agree with you that people. I don't know if I would say even would surprise me, but I believe a lot in people and their ability to process information and make decisions and take things in. And along those lines, I was wondering how much of a citizen assembly role is really is about education. Like when I think about talking to my colleagues in the Legislative Assembly and people in general, I mean, really it seems that there is an almost unanimous agreement that climate change is an issue we have to address. It's one of the defining issues of our time along those lines. But one of the concerns that's brought up is we're going to make recommendations, out of our committee here, our standing committee, and we might not get the uptake in the general public because it might not be fully understood why the action's being taken, what it's for. So how much of a citizen assembly is actually about education as opposed to having them make recommendations back?
Laura?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's such a key component. I think of this process and when it's happened, citizens assembly, the body itself is one part usually of a bigger participatory process through which the assembly itself is very publicized usually. There's media outreach, there's education, there are ways for people who aren't necessarily selected directly to be part of the assembly to engage either through submitting comments or watching online the deliberations and the presentations. So it is, I think, fundamental to have this process be part of a bigger public education program, and also, to be representative of an inviting from this, in this case, the government of PEI to the citizens themselves to say, we have this goal, we've set this target, we know where we need to be, and we're now inviting you to participate in a couple of different ways to determine how. And so I think that on the side of building trust, I think that that's one of the key components to that is allowing people to express their opinions, even if they're not necessarily part of the citizens assembly. And then also the act itself of forming that body, actually it's difficult recognizing that as a government body, you don't have all the answers, and you're actually looking to your citizens to participate and to help shape those policies, reinforces that sense of trust and also sense of sort of buy-in essentially onto that this is the right way to go forward. I mean, I think that it's a little bit easier when you have a specific island community as someone who also lives on an island to create those barriers to say, okay, we know that our response to climate change needs to be different than the next province over because we have a specific local economy and we have a specific history and all of these things, and we're coming to you to ask how you think those things should shape the decisions that we make going forward as a community. So yes, I mean, ultimately it is public education, but it's also public engagement. It's much more than just telling people, here's the science and here's the solution. It's much more of around, like, here are the pathways potentially that we can get ourselves out of this mess. What do you think is the best way forward, given that we're, trusting you with this information and to make decisions for yourselves? So yes, is the short answer to your question. It's absolutely about public education as well.
Thanks, Brad. Thanks, Laura. We'll move to Ola Hammerlin now.
Thank you. It's really impressive these decisions these assemblies have been able to make, and I'm just wondering, trying to find out exactly more what the reason is why they're successful. Am I correct in that one of the reasons is that the question that the assembly is supposed to answer is really set to begin with? They are assembled for a specific, simple, straightforward reason like climate change. Well, I mean, obviously it's a complex issue, but it's not as if they decide on what to talk about. They talk about climate change.
Yes, absolutely. I like to sort of talk about how Citizens Assembly, the process is an example of very deep facilitation. So I have found, as in my role as a facilitator, not in specific groups, that setting the framework for people is an incredibly important part. So asking the right questions will always be sort of the first hurdle, I think, in having people be successful at this venture. So in the case of Ireland, it was how can the state itself, the federal government, make Ireland a leader in tackling climate change? And then there were very specific areas under which citizens were sort of asked to deliberate on specific policy proposals, or then also provide alternatives or think about alternatives. So agriculture, burning peat, which is a very significant source of heat in Ireland, subsidies for specific forms of agriculture, renewable energy, transportation. So when we ask the questions, for example, if depending on the sources of emissions that a place has, so like in northern climates, usually it's buildings and energy efficiency and heating that are a major source of greenhouse gas emissions. And so the questions themselves would need to reflect sort of the biophysical reality of the challenge that we face, and then also the political considerations that we would have to go up against. So yes, I think that, of course, if you put a group of 100 people in a room and say, okay, fix climate change and we'll help you, we'll give you some information, it would be a mess. It would be very difficult. However, when given a specific remit and a very specific target of, we are going to get to the end of this process and we're going to answer these questions together, it is a lot easier for people to go through the learning process and the deliberation process knowing that they're trying to get to as close to a consensus as possible at the end.
Thank you, Laura. Ole?
It sounds good. I'm also worried about you were mentioning the one key element is in selecting the citizens is kind of a random selection, and it seems to me that part of the success for the process is that somehow if you ask citizens if they want to participate in climate change discussions, somehow I would think you would end up with a lot of people that had an interest and opinion of that particular subject, which is not necessarily random, if you will.
Yeah, it is definitely a difficulty to try to keep things representative in terms of public opinion. So, as I mentioned before, there are a couple of different ways that you can actually select. You can use specific demographics to ensure sort of a demographic representation of the community, or you can use specific public opinions. There are different tools and different metrics by which you can make those choices. I think it's, in the case of the United Kingdom and the nationwide poll or the nationwide Citizens Assembly, I find it really intriguing that they've used public opinion on climate change specifically so that they have a representative sample of that rather than trying to bias it already through using a different sort of cross-section of society. However, I do think that when it comes to actually making the selection and not trying to stack the deck, if you will, with people who are already concerned and think that climate change is important, there are tools essentially that can be used to make sure that doesn't happen, and that is just a quality control sort of issue and a transparency issue as well. So, one of the key things about this process is being very open about how citizens are selected, because it's not an electoral position. This is something that is a different type of representation that people aren't necessarily used to. However, I will say, public opinion on climate change is changing rapidly. In the United States, at least, 17% more Americans think that climate change is an emergency situation now than they did in April of last year. So that's a pretty rapid change. So I think in terms of finding people who are concerned and finding people who are educated, that's not a problem so long as you are, it's not a problem to engage with them so long as you're being representative and being transparent about the people you're selecting and the selection process itself.
Thank you, Laura. Ole?
So I would be really curious to know the relationship between the decisions made by the Citizens Assembly and how that was followed up with the legislature, or is it too soon to say anything there?
Are you referring to the United Kingdom?
Ireland, I think, was the one that,
So the recommendations themselves were presented to the Parliament, and as of, to my understanding, none of the specific recommendations, there were 13, they weren't necessarily policy prescriptions, some of them, but some of them were. None of the specific policy prescriptions, for example, I mentioned the removal of all subsidies from peat harvesting, which is a significant source of carbon emissions. That has not yet been presented to the legislature or presented in the legislature as a new piece of legislation. And this is the difficulty, and this is the importance, I think, of defining the pathway for where the Citizens Assembly recommendations go. In the case of the question of amending the Constitution around abortion in Ireland, that was very clear from the onset that the question would be put to a referendum after the Citizens Assembly deliberated and came out with a recommendation. Whereas in the case of climate change, that pathway wasn't defined previously. So I think that, in the case of Oxford and in the case of the UK and in France, those pathways are a little more clear. But it is difficult because, and this is where some people, especially, sort of get hung up a little bit about, is that by creating a Citizens Assembly, you are sort of giving an accompaniment to the normal legislative process of making laws, essentially. There are some people who advocate for actually normal legislative bodies to be replaced by citizens' assemblies as the primary legislation-making body in a country. That's not what I'm advocating for in this case necessarily, but I do think that it's incredibly important to define where those recommendations go before you start the process itself. Because a citizens' assembly might come up with recommendations that are much stronger and sometimes difficult to implement or cost money or do, sort of go against what a government has said in terms of their goals on climate change and what they're willing to do. And so it's important to be clear, how accountability is going to be enforced beforehand.
Thank you, Laura. Ole?
Well, it's interesting. I'm just recently elected myself, and when I think of the election and the legislature, in many ways it meets the same standards as your Citizens Assembly. We have a wide range of people of all runs of life, wide range of ages, not as many women as we should have, but a fair bit. And each legislator represents roughly 5,000 people, so it's a very close relationship. Did I say I consider the election results almost close to random, although it's first past the post, but very close. Really what's missing, it seems to me, is just the legislator sitting down and saying, well, we need to solve climate issues, and not that we're not trying, but we're not putting ourselves in a room for 3 weeks to do it. Maybe that's what's needed.
I would love to see the legislative bodies of the world sit down for 3 weekends and only talk about climate change. I think that it really does. You've hit essentially on why it's a useful exercise, is because it does give decision makers access to a representative cross section of society and what they think after presented with serious and accurate information, rather than just relying on public opinion polls to help you do your job of representing, what your constituents think and what they'd like to have happen. So essentially, yes, I think that it would be wonderful if the legislatures of the world had enough time to sit down and really dig through these really complex issues, rather than working. It's difficult. There's for example, the select committee on climate change. A lot of work that gets done in the legislative process happens through committee with specific small groups of people who care about these issues, and also the reliance on experts. And so what this process is essentially trying to provide another source of information and legitimacy to that process, to the legislative process, so that we can move forward if we're running into the issue of not enough time and gridlock and over reliance on experts and under sort of reliance on normal people's lives. I think there's a lot to be said for expanding democracy essentially in this way, and giving more people access to this system, even when our systems are already representative and democratic in the first place.
Laura, thank you, Ole. We'll take a question from Natalie Jameson.
Great. Thanks very much, Laura. I thoroughly enjoyed your presentation, and I'm learning a lot in the process, so thanks for taking the time to be with us today. I appreciate it. I just have one question for you, and you actually already touched on it around consensus. So do these assemblies always achieve consensus, and what happens if participants are unable to do so?
It's a good question. As I mentioned, usually the decision-making process comes after this long period of learning and deliberation. And oftentimes, it doesn't necessarily need consensus. It's usually actually conducted by just a typical majority vote. And then the percentage of the vote is actually sort of represented in the recommendations. So on specific issues, it might be 80% of a group of 100. So 80 people think that a certain recommendation is good or correct and the right way forward, and 20% doesn't. Sometimes 100%. I talk about approaching consensus because if, for example, let's just say a carbon tax was put on to a referendum right now on Prince Edward Island. Let's just say we've worked out all the details of that. The actual, first of all, the voter turnout may or may not reflect actually people's opinions and the ability of those who can vote to vote. And then also, it could be really close. It could be really, close to 50-50. And so in terms of just simple majority, having the deliberative process helps people get closer to consensus, so that in the process we hear, not just through voting, though it's an important tool, where people are getting hung up, why they don't think it's a good idea, how the recommendation could be improved as a result, and then getting people closer to feeling comfortable with having, one way or another means that you can get results in the 80 to 100% approval or disapproval, depending on the question, range. So consensus isn't necessary, and I think it's also a very difficult way to govern. It's wonderful when it happens and everyone is completely on the same page, but there will always be people who don't necessarily feel that a certain policy decision is entirely in their favor and might vote against it. But I do think that it's still a really useful a process to sort of get closer to moving together as a community or as a society, as a nation. And it's shown to be effective.
Great. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Natalie. I might ask a question now, but what I want to do is I would just like to read you a paragraph and see if it connects into what we're talking about. Then I'll give you some context afterward. This was written in April, and the time frame is between April and December. So I'll just read it to you. For that reason, the government will convene a panel made up of citizens and elected members to consider reforms to this legislature. The goal will be to introduce constructive change to the way public input is gathered by this assembly.
and new rules to govern the open transmission of information to islanders. This exercise will begin within the next 6 months, and the government expects to table significant amendments to the Legislative Assembly within the next year. While respect of tradition and institution, the government also understands that the rigid adherence to the past is no emblem of strength. To maintain public trust, we must evolve in a respectful, reasonable manner. We also need, as a priority, to find a way that we can better engage our young people in the democratic process, as what we do today should be in their interest.
So that was. Could you just give us some information, or what's your take on that passage?
I have never heard anything quite so eloquent come from any legislature in the United States. I can tell you that. No, I think that that's a fantastic place to be in terms of as an assembly, as a legislative body, to recognize the need to expand the sort of traditions of how we pass laws. I think that without knowing the full context around it, I mean, it seems as though the government of PEI is taking the question of public participation very seriously and looking to institutionalize it in a way that is more significant, and I think will be I think of a really significant benefit to the future of both the government itself and also building trust. And as you mentioned, engaging young people. Climate change, as a young person myself, is the most important issue to me in terms of politically, and I think to a lot of people. So it's incredibly exciting to read. I had not been aware that was the context in which this conversation was happening. So.
Well, now the bad news. That was in the speech from the throne in April, and we missed our targets, and we did not do anything with that assembly. So the reason why I'm excited, optimistic, but a little bit upset we missed our targets, and we had the Premier in to talk in another standing committee where he downplayed that notion and brought it to another standing committee. And the reason why I brought it up with you is because I think this conversation today could be a good place to bring that back to the forefront. We all make mistakes. The government was new, obviously. They've done a good deal around climate change, but hearing you speak today has allowed myself to maybe rejuvenate that passage and that argument and to fight for the people in that regard. Yeah, I didn't have a question, but sorry. Go ahead, Laura.
No, that's too bad to hear, but I'm glad and excited for you. I think in terms of this conversation, I talk about democracy and democratic engagement as a conversation. It is a continual process. It's not simply vote and you're done for the next however many years. I think as citizens and as also representatives of citizens themselves, we have the sort of civic duty to continue talking about process, not just policy. And so it is good to hear that even if that specific passage was not implemented at the specific time, that it is something that's an ongoing process and is being connected to the complex policy issues of the time, like climate change. So that's my response to your non-question.
Thank you very much, and you have my commitment today. I'm going to go back and write a letter again to the minister and to the premier saying that this was a good exercise and we should look at that passage mixed with what we hear here today and get this file moving forward. So thank you. I'm going to move over to Stephen Howard now, and then Brad Trivers. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. A couple of my questions kind of got covered there, but I do have one left, and it has to do with protection from lobbying. And if we have a citizens' assembly that's not used to being lobbied and their names are public and whatnot, is there any sort of protections that are normally in place to ensure these people's decisions are not influenced by influencers?
That's an important question, because there absolutely would be the attempts to make that happen. And so in terms of protections that could be in place, I think that, training specifically for for all of the Citizens Assembly members is going to be incredibly important, and is usually part of the process of being selected. Disclosing any potential conflicts of interest up front, I think, is also important. I think that it is just something to be aware of when designing this kind of process, and recognizing that as you ask people to participate, there is also sort of the responsibility as the facilitating body to provide them with that context, and also with the knowledge so that they can arm themselves, or at least, be open and honest about where their opinions are coming from. And that often just has to do with transparency and building trust amongst that group. I'm not actually specifically aware of, if there's publicly available materials on examples of protections or trainings that Assembly members go through, but I can look into it and could send some materials along if I find anything.
Stephen Howard.
Thank you, Chair. That does wrap up my questions for you, Ms. Berry, but I just wanted to comment that I saw you speak when you were here on the island, and it was my pleasure to put your name forward to come here and present to us today, remotely and whatnot, but it's very also encouraging to know that Member McNeely's on board with making sure that these kind of changes that we so sorely need are put in place. So I just wanted to say thank you.
Thank you very much.
Brad Trivers? No, okay. Ola Hammerlin?
Thank you. I just have one more question relating to what's the ideal size of a citizen assembly? What size group works best?
Sorry, I just was waiting. Generally speaking, anywhere between 50 and 100 people is usually about the right size in terms of getting both getting a representative sample of any one population. It's important to make sure that it's not too small, but then also in the case of rather large groups of people, I've talked, for example, about citizens' assemblies in the United States. Our legislature is 430 some odd representatives in total at the national level, and so I've spoken about how, if, for example, the United States were to do something, or in Canada, province by province might be a better way to approach this kind of question. So having 50 to 100 citizens, depending on the size, of course, and the population of the province, representing each of those groups or each of those governments and those populations, rather than one big assembly of a couple hundred people for the entire nation. So on the very tangible level, 50 to 100 is usually good. It's not good to go over about 150 people in any group, just because it's difficult to facilitate. People can sometimes be left out of a conversation. And also just for the very sort of tangible reasons of finding space to fit that many people, and the number of trained facilitators to help them work through that process.
Thank you, Laura. Ole?
Yeah, one last question. So generally speaking, in the various assemblies, are they offered a small stipend or honorarium to participate and cover costs and stuff?
Yes. So usually, in terms of making up for their time and the energy and the brain space that they are dedicating to the problem, yes, usually a stipend or an honorarium it's provided to participants. I think so in terms of covering transportation costs and potentially food if that's not provided. Generally speaking, a per diem is common.
Thank you very much, Ole. Thank you very much, Laura. And please accept our thanks on behalf of this committee here. I think we had a great engagement. I'm not sure if you can see the public gallery, but there's I can't count. There's about 12 or 13 people at a committee meeting on a Thursday afternoon. So you definitely did yourself justice with what you talked about. And on behalf of this committee, we thank you very much. Now is maybe we'll take a quick short break before we move forward, just to turn this off and move forward. So again, thank you very much, Laura. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me, and it's been wonderful. I would love to come back and speak anytime in the future. So, thanks.
Thank you. Okay. We'll take a short recess. welcome back after that great presentation, and we're going to move on to the next number 5 is Brad Trivers.
There's just one point of clarification I did want. You had mentioned to the witness today that you were going to send a letter asking that the passage that you'd read be followed. I just wanted to make sure you weren't doing that as the chair of a committee, that you meant that you were going to do that as an individual MLA.
Yeah, that's correct. I'll do it. I'm doing that as an individual MLA. Not as the chair of this committee, because I'm just here for today. So
Yeah,
sure, good clarification.
I just wanted to caution you. Remember, when you're chairing a committee, that when you make commitments like that, it could be taken that you're doing that on behalf of the committee, and that's something that I think the committee might want to have input on. So
absolutely, you're absolutely right, and I will. I'll take that into advisement, and it's a good point.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else? Would anybody else want to comment on the presentation or anything at this time? Ola?
Well, I just had one comment, and I looked up at the Climate Mobilization website, and there's all kinds of interesting stuff, and it goes way beyond just citizens' assemblies. I mean, they have a plan how to make Boston carbon neutral in 5 years. That's worth reading just to see what kind of level of input they're really looking for. They use the words like World War effort, which is that's the kind of level of public input and directives which is, in their opinion, needed to get somewhere, and it's very interesting to read.
Well, what we might do is, because I'm just here as the interim chair today, maybe we'll make a note that this was suggested by a committee member to have a look at that document so do you have that document, or it's a website? Okay,
it's a website.
Okay, perfect. Yes, yeah, so we'll include that all to the committee members, if that's okay. Yeah, perfect. So we'll move on to we'll do the review of correspondence, number 5 right now. So I'll pass it over to Ryan as the clerk.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There's no letters to the committee or from the committee to review, but one thing I do bring to your attention is before you put a draft text for newspaper ads. First of all, we talked about some communications efforts last week, but we didn't consider whether the committee wants to advertise its upcoming schedule of committee meetings in communities in newspapers. So first of all, I need to know, does the committee want to do that? And secondly, what I've got here is a draft text that would appear in such ads on the first page. And then on the second page of the document, there's just a couple of examples from, I think, the last time a committee had some travel meetings of the ads that they use. So these ads wouldn't look necessarily exactly like that, but that they're just there to give you an example of what newspaper ads typically look like. So essentially, I would just like to know if the committee wants to advertise its meetings in February and early March in newspapers, and the text that I provided there for you, is it acceptable as drafted?
Did any committee members like to comment on that? Yeah, Stephen Howard?
Well, I think we definitely want to advertise it. It'd be fairly disingenuous or perceived as disingenuous if we didn't advertise these meetings to folks. So I think the answer is a definitive yes there for me. Yeah, that's all there.
Excellent. Anybody else at this time? Brad Trivers?
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, I definitely think we should advertise, and it should be in the print media like the major newspapers on the island, or the newspapers on the island, but also make sure we do up something that's on the social media, various social medias, whether it be Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. I don't know what else you want to add in there.
Yeah.
I did have a comment on the draft text. It says your views on greenhouse gas emissions. And maybe we could say something like your views on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Just, it's a little I know, maybe it's a little picky, but just, I think it rolls off the tongue a little bit more.
Yeah. Would that be something we need to do a motion?
No, it's just
Just in the title, community meetings,
Yeah.
your views on reducing greenhouse
Text
gases.
is, yeah. Read the text.
just see if everyone's in
Yeah.
Share the views with the committee on ways to reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
Yes, Brad Trivers?
The other thing is, I mean, I was looking at the sample ads from the Special Committee on Democratic Renewal. Maybe I'm just getting old, but I had to put on my glasses and really get into that. There's a lot of information that's very small text. I'm not sure what the costs are involved, but if we could do something with larger font, maybe these aren't even actually the real sizes, but I would think something with a larger font, make it a little easier to read. And it may be cost prohibitive in the print media, but on social media, advertise each individual meeting as well. And also do it this is just a suggestion for the committee to talk about, but I always find that if there's a picture associated with it, it grabs people's attention a lot more. So just some suggestions there, just like member from Summerside said, we want to make sure we get as many people out as possible, and this is our time to do it and make sure people know about it. I don't know. I'm going to throw that out there, Clerk. I know you guys aren't graphic designers and all that kind of thing, but.
I'll open it up to the floor now. I think those are relatively good suggestions, but I just look at the dates too. These meetings are coming fairly quickly, so I think we have to make some decisions probably today, I would think, to get Stephen Howard.
Clerk, would we normally just advertise all of these meetings once, like in this example? Would this have gone out once and then not again before the various meetings that were being held? Was it just one advertisement?
I have to go back and check with the Democratic Renewal Committee, but I believe it was just once in advance of the first meeting.
Okay.
Yeah, it is costly to put ads of this size in newspapers, but yeah, I believe that was the case. Now, in terms of social media, as mentioned, we can advertise that way as frequently as we want through our own Facebook account, and the Assembly has a Twitter feed as well. We also are able to purchase, as I understand it, a Facebook promotion or Facebook boosting of ads.
I was going to bring that
I'm
up.
not sure the financials around how frequently we could do that, but that is an option too.
It's yeah, that's what I was going to bring up. It's fairly inexpensive to do a Facebook boost and whatnot, not just release it on your Facebook, but to actually promote it to people or actively promote it on social media. So yeah, I'm with Mr. Trivers there. We should have this print media for sure, and social media should have a certain budget applied to it as well and actively promote.
Sure.
Perfect. And may I suggest too, that it's a good opportunity for this committee to do, committee members to do a quick 10 or 15 second video to promote it in the different areas here. I've talked about this in other committees. Maybe the minister and various committee members can look at having that as a question that they could do next week, and you can get those videos up and we can engage people at PEI. So I'll leave that as my suggestion for the committee. Natalie?
Yeah, just a quick comment. Do you have a storm plan?
Brian?
There is a general storm plan that we follow with committee meetings at the Assembly, and it's essentially when there's a question of bad weather, the clerk consults the chair, because it's the chair ultimately who decides whether the meeting will go ahead or not. Often there's consultation with the rest of the committee as well. In terms of alternate dates, not at present. We don't have alternate dates set out yet. That's something we could consider discussing further, but I can't say at the moment whether the venues we've booked have additional availability. I'd have to check.
That's fair.
Natalie?
Sure, and in terms of communicating that with the public, social media, they need to call the Assembly.
Yeah.
I see it.
Yeah,
I don't know if it's worth making note of that in case of weather. It might be worth just noting that on your advertisement. Again, I'm not on the committee, so I don't want to. Yeah.
With the assembly storm plan, we do have a process that we follow when there is a change to get it out to the media on the website, to witnesses maybe appearing, et cetera.
Great.
So it's widely broadcast.
Sure. Yeah, sure. I'm not familiar with this format because as I haven't been to any of these smaller community events, so that's no, that's wonderful. Thank you.
So maybe at this time what we'll do is we will make a note for the clerk to discuss all of these options that were suggested with the full-time chair of this committee at your earliest convenience, and make the appropriate changes that would try to get the best ad possible.
Well, Mr. Chair, I think I do need approval or changes to the ad approved today to meet timelines to get this out in time.
Well, let's go through the changes one at a time. I think just for the record. So we'll get you to read we'll get you to read one change at a time, and then after that we'll agree as a committee, and then so we'll make those changes official. How does that sound?
That's fine with me. I have only heard in terms of the text, the one change to the title, your views on reducing greenhouse gas emissions instead of what's posed there.
Brad Travers?
Another potential change we could consider. So you have the title in 2 lines. I think it's important that people understand that the meeting is about climate change, like on the topic of climate change. So a suggestion would be, community meetings, climate change, your views on greenhouse gas emissions, or reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Since you have 2 lines there anyways, looks like there's not enough room. Keep it centered.
So we'll open the floor to that change. Anybody? Would that be sufficient?
I think that's.
Ole?
I think it's an excellent idea. I'm just wondering, are we using climate change or are we using climate crisis? Kind of lately that has been, no?
I think, well, I don't know, but I was like, if it's a climate change, that's in the department title, I would suggest that people would know that it's a climate change, but that's just my opinion, so.
I agree with your notion there, Gord. Just in the fact that this is the Special Committee on Climate Change, it's in the name already and whatnot, I certainly don't disagree that we're in a crisis, though.
Yeah, perfect. Is that okay? Okay, Ole, yeah. Anybody else? No, perfect. So, all in favor of the title change today, say aye. Aye. Perfect. Okay, good. That's one. And then I do believe we were talking about trying as best we can on font size. I think it might be more of a try.
I don't think so. I'd have to check into with the newspapers in terms of the font size. I would assume the larger the ad becomes, the more expensive it becomes, but yeah.
Perfect. Okay. So we will suggest as a committee, if it's okay, to try and suggest a larger font if possible. So all in favor of that, say aye. 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 Great. And then what was it? Okay, yeah. Anything you want to add about social media?
I don't think there's anything really further about social media. That's already part of the committee's communications plan to advertise as much as possible on the social media, and if the committee's in agreement, we can look at boosting it through Facebook too.
Specifically, though, the minister had mentioned adding pictures and making sure they were part of the shareable content because the metrics on that increase engagement. I don't know what kind of picture we'd include with that.
Oh, sure.
Brad Travers?
I would be open to letting whoever's designing the ad choose the photo that they think would be appropriate. And I think it's really important that we advertise the meetings individually as well. Those are key. I really like your suggestion about us doing little videos as well, which we can do on our own. I don't think we need to vote on that.
I really do want to put it down. Okay. All right. We'll just leave it as a suggestion then.
Well, no. I mean, we could say we're going to do it, but yeah. I mean, whatever.
Perfect. So we can add that it was. We will ensure the committee. We will implore the committee to potentially advertise on social media with a small video. I don't want to make it that anybody has to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so.
But you're talking about, like me as an MLA, because it's coming to Rustico, getting
Yeah.
on there, doing a little Holdix pulling
Yeah,
out, and just
exactly.
want to invite everybody to come out.
Exactly.
We're going to be talking about how
Yeah.
to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We want to hear from you.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Perfect. Steve? Yes?
Oh, that sounds fine and dandy to me. Something that just occurred to me while you were talking about that is that, it's incumbent upon us to just share what is going to be going out from the Legislative Assembly on our personal or our MLA pages and whatnot. So I just like to throw that on the record there as well.
Yeah,
that,
exactly.
maybe all of us can share it to get that organic reach.
Perfect.
And just to clarify, you would like a picture on this of some sort on the social media advertisement, and you're leaving it up to.
Perhaps something showing some data on maybe a graph of our emissions and our targets and things like that. Just something along those lines to give you a little bit of guidance.
Might I suggest the graph from the Climate Change Secretariat's presentation that shows PEI's sources of
Yes.
GHG emissions?
I think that would be a good
The
one.
one that says 47% transportation.
I think that would be a good one.
Would that work for the committee?
Brad
That sounds good. I'm willing to leave it in your capable hands.
Yeah.
Yeah, you and the chair, I think, could probably work it out.
Okay, perfect. Great.
Okay.
As long as it's not like a picture of the chair.
Yeah. And for the,
Ola?
Just notice one other thing, maybe you have asked it already in some other thing, but, this doesn't invite people who wants to address the committee here, for instance. Is that an option? Like you could, for instance, add down the bottom line, if you want to address the committee at one of your above meetings or at Cole's building in Charlottetown. Just a
I
consideration.
That's a good point, and it'll be noted maybe to the chair, but I do believe there's a process to that everyone is allowed to submit, applications to talk to this committee too. But because I'm only the temporary chair, I wouldn't know, but maybe that's something that you can talk to, because I think we need to hear from as many Islanders as we can as well. So, good point. Yeah. Mr. Clerk?
I could suggest maybe changing that to register to address the committee at a meeting. Meaning not just those community meetings, but any meeting, because it's correct, anyone could put in a request to speak here before the committee in this chamber. Sure. It's ultimately up to the committee to say yes or no, but would that suit the committee, that change?
So it seems like everybody's in favor of that change. Thank you for bringing that up, Ole. Natalie?
yeah, no, I just wanted to put it on the record that I'm really looking forward to watching those videos.
Yeah, absolutely. You can be in mine if you want. Natalie's going to be in mine.
Yeah. I'll certainly participate
can be in mine too.
if there's an opportunity. I'll definitely participate.
Excellent. Well, I think it's important that we use social media too as MLAs to get people's input and to try to get out to these events. So great. Is that good?
I think I'm good.
That's good. Okay. So thanks for that. Can I just review the schedule?
If you want, but there's actually another meeting before these meetings
Okay.
too, on January 30th.
Okay. So what we'll do now is I'll just review the schedule really quickly for these meetings, and we'll see if I could make my own video here, see if I could do it. So to let everybody know, your views on greenhouse gas emissions reductions is coming to an area near you, and they're going to start with the first meeting. These are very important meetings to attend. The Special Committee on Climate Change has been working incredibly hard, and we want your input. So please come out to a meeting, and the first meeting, which is not on the sheet, but that's okay, we'll figure this out, is going to be read by Ryan, which is on January 31st.
No, January 30th.
January 30th.
And that is here in the George Coles building in this chamber at 1:30 p.m.
Great. And so that's the first, and we encourage all Islanders to come out for that. After that, this committee goes on the road Thursday, February 6th at the Muscush Rec Center. 31 School Street in Miscush. Then, following that, the next week, Thursday, February 13th, the Royal Canadian Legion Branch, number 6, 221 Phillip Street in Tignish. Following that, Thursday, February 20th, Cimbria Lions Club Community Center in the great area of
Rustico.
Yes, Rustico. So, following that, it's Thursday, February 27th, the Morel Fire Hall, 15 Park Street, Morel. And then finally, Thursday, March 5th, Loyalist Country Inn and Comfort Center, 195 Heather Moist Drive in Summerside. All meetings will begin at 6:30. So if you need more information, go to the Legislative Assembly website. Thank you.
Gordon McNeely will be at all the meetings, ready, willing to greet you at the door.
Anyway, so no, that's an important stuff, so we hope to see you there. At this time, I want to move on to the next item, which is new business. New business, anybody? So this concludes our meeting for Thursday, January 23rd. Can I get a motion to adjourn? Adjourn. Adjourn, Brad Trivers. Thank you very much.